So I'm saying we need to think about being diverse in our farming operation, as diverse as we've been in changing equipment, you know. And with that, you know, you saw this picture earlier. This is just a great 5-way blend. This happened to be built after a CRP farm. You know, we went in and asked NRCS if we could kill what was there about a month and a half or 2 months before the contract was over. And they says, what are you going to do? And I says, we're going to plant cover crop, and then we're going to roll that crop. We're going to plant corn. We're not going to use any herbicides. We're not going to use any nitrogen. And my NRCS officer says, well, you're not going to get any corn. And I says, probably not, you know, but we're going to give it a try. So this is how we did it. So we didn't plow it. You know, it seems like every time CRP comes out, they either want to till it or plow it or burn it. And then they lose more soils the first year than they saved all the 10 years it was in the program. So this is what we did. And here we are in the spring, rolling that cover crop, getting ready to plant into it, you know. And there's what's left. You know, there's the hairy vetch, the purple flower. You know, if you visualize back in the 80s when everybody had that thag carpet in their living room with your toes went in and it was about 3 or 4 inches deep, well, that's just about what that field looks like, you know. And we've got lots of things going on. We got beneficial insects coming because we got flowered things there. We got the soil covered. We're keeping it cool. We can plant into it, you know. It's not a problem. I go to Iowa and show this picture, and they say, my goodness, he says, there's no way you can plant through that. You know, it's got to be brown. It don't have to be brown. Just learn how to make this piece of equipment work. And there it's real simple. A fluted coulter running about 1.5 inches deep in the soil, seed disc running about 1 3/4 to 1.5 inches, and rubber press wheels, you know. If you would like to have row cleaners, hydraulic down pressure, all that stuff, call me. I got it in the shed. You know, be happy to let you see it. You know? But, you know, the coulter does a nice job. You know, as we see this thing work, it's not moving any soil. It's just cutting the residue, you know. In behind, look at the planter. There's no soil being moved, you know. This had to be a 15-inch planter, but we're planting 30-inch rows, so that's why you see the little green sticking to those every other wheel. But we're accomplishing what we want, and no soil's being moved, so we're not losing anything. No dust. Guess what? That soil's 58 degrees. In 4 days, that corn's up. We don't have to worry about it. Can you cut the residue? You know, yes you can. You know, doesn't that look nice? I mean, you couldn't cut it any better with a pair of scissors. You know, but there it is again. And this is laying over the seed trench, so we don't have to worry about, I don't worry about closing as much as I need to, because I got this cover there, holding the moisture there, keeping that from a shrink and cell happening, so it don't uncover the seed. You know, works really well. Again, you saw this picture. I love this picture. You know, there's 3.5 inches of thatch or 3 inches of thatch. 5 days after the corn's planted, first true leaves are coming out. And look how dark green they are, Bob. You know, does it need anything right there? Absolutely not. You know, here it is a little later. You know, it looks ugly. You know, my conventional neighbors are just having fits with my landlords. My, look at that mess David's got. If you just rent us that farm, we'll make it all brown and pretty. You know? Well, I got news for him. We got to make it look good, you know. Again, there the corn is. You've seen this. This is a picture I wanted to show you. We spent a lot of time trying to help all the people in our community. We have a day in August that we invite people to come just to see the farm. This happened to be in June. This is a bunch of new employees from NRCS. We train 3 times a year to NRCS employees. And here they're walking the field, and you see that guy with a shovel. We give everybody a shovel so they understand how to use it, you know? And they look at this corn, and this corn has not had starter fertilizer, has not had herbicides on it, and has not nitrogen yet. But look at the color of it. That's what I wanted to show you. Look how dark green it is. You know? Yes, we can do this. You need to do it at a small scale as you're starting and learn how to adjust to it and reduce your nutrients. You know? You don't have to bite the bullet and throw it all away. Just do it a little bit at a time and learn how you do it. You know? We talked about soil temperature. You saw this morning. You know? Here's the field we didn't roll. The corn struggles a little bit until it gets up to see the sunlight. It gets spindly. That's why we like to roll it. Lay it down flat. When it first comes up, we don't have trouble with it, you know. But there's my neighbor's soil, you know. Which one of those pictures would you like? You know, would you like this one? You know, or do you like this one? Look at the crusting soil. Look at that leaf beside that temperature gauge. It's yellow. Guess what? If I was looking at that field, I'd say that field needs nitrogen. You know what it really needs? Is an anhydrous toolbar with no tank hooked to it and just add air to the ground. You know? It's going to increase the yield. It's starving for nutrients. That ground's crusty. It's hard. You know? Oh, here's what I love. When I like to go up to Lake Erie, you know, I get my big earthworm out and we go up and catch a 30-pound bass. You know, it's no problem. Got plenty of worm on the hook. You know, 18, 20-inch earthworms. Guess how deep the holes are, how big and round they are. They're like a writing pencil. The water will go in, you know. You're not saying anything.
That's all right, you're doing fine.
Oh, okay. Of course, here's our soils. You know, I mean, this tells the whole story. You know, here's what it looked like when we started, and here's where we're at today. We have not degraded the soil. We've improved the soil. We're now not using, on that black soil, we're not using any bought nutrients, you know. We're signing the back a check in 2014. We're not signing the front, you know. Our test weights are up. Our digestible protein in the corn's up. You know, we're producing 9.5 to 9.9 protein corn instead of 4% corn that my neighbor produces, you know. You saw this. We're not going to spend much time with this. This is the problem, people. If we don't start as producers to control our soils, and we have this problem again, and we was lucky this year, we had a cool summer, so the water never got extremely warm. We could have had the biggest algae bloom they ever saw in Lake Erie, but the water never got above 84 degrees, so we didn't have the bloom. If we have this, and the recreational industry and the fishing industry takes it on the chin again, there will be rules coming from somewhere to tell us what to do. So I'm saying let's try to learn how to keep our soils where it belongs so we can redo this. They've reduced this in the Chesapeake Bay. If you get around the Chesapeake Bay, it's all green. You know, but you ought to see the notebook those poor farmers have to keep. You know, every time they get up in the morning, they got to write something down in that book. That's how bad it is out there. You know, I love my conventional neighbor. We have a lot of fun together. I saw this thing working, and I was shelling corn across the road. This is a fall picture 2 years ago, and I'd never seen anything so beautiful in all my life. I said, man, I just got to go across the road and talk to him and brag to him how nice it was. He didn't know I was going to use it to tell him how bad things are, you know. But, you know, here he comes up the field. He's pulling a 36-inch deep ripper, 27 inches deep with 42-inch cutters on the front, 36-inch cutters on the back, a rolling basket and a 4-bar Hera. And he says, when he pulled up there and stopped, he says, David, he says, we haven't grown a crop in here for 6 years, but we're going to do her this year because we've loosened her 27 inches deep, you know. And I said, that's really nice. Guess what? He hadn't grown a crop there yet, you know. He's still trying to use it, you know. But what he's doing, as he adds that oxygen to the soil, he's burning up all the carbon. You know, can you imagine if you went home tonight or tomorrow afternoon and when this is over and your house is gone because the wind blew it away, you had a hurricane, you had all kinds of problems that can come? Would you rebuild it? And then 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, the same thing happens? How many times did you rebuild your house? That's why the earthworms and everything leaves when you destroy this soil, you know. And this is what we're doing as conventional tillage. We're losing carbon dioxide. We're losing organic matters. This is not the moon. And Dave's going to talk about this a little bit later. He's got a really good picture. But this is my uncle's farm. He's 96 years old. He's not going to change. You know, he's down to 13 bushel of beans per acre because he's grazing there for 40 years. You know, he don't know what's going on. There's the reason. High bacteria-driven soils that take lots of nutrients, bought nutrients. Look down there, he has no fungi. He has no nematodes. He has no protozoa. How does he make the soil work? He can't, so he's got to buy the products. You know? Whoops, a little fast. Bill, this is what it looks like when we're planting. Our rows are damn crooked, but we get a hell of a population. You know? But boy, we love it, you know? If you look real close, you can see a little mark out there. You know, we're not fortunate enough to have guidance. This happens to be one of our 27 landlords that has less than 5 acres. You know? So that's one of those little 4-acre fields. But it'll grow corn, you know? There's the biomass. That's 47,000 pounds. That's 4.5 inches of thatch. Corn's planted. I went home and I'm just eating supper and I'm feeling really good. It's green and growing. There's the results. Everybody's seen corn. Here's the real results. If you look at the very top right-hand corner, left-hand corner of that picture, that says 208 bushel. That's a rolling field average. If you've not seen a gleaner combine, that's what it tells us. The second one there says when I took the picture, it was averaging 276. Guess what that field of corn made me with no nitrogen, no fungicides, no insecticides, no seed corn treatment? We had $596 an acre profit. Did any of you do that good last fall? You know? My grandson told me we got to do a better job with the yield map. The reason is he's in black lines. He says, Grandpa, you got to raise up the header and get out of the field. You know, so evidently, haven't been doing it right for years. You know. But what we're after is we want these plants to have deep roots. Look at the cottage cheese of that soil. You know, if you like cottage cheese, you know, a large curd. If you don't like cottage cheese, just go buy some. Open a can, go out in the field and see if your soils look like that. If they don't, you don't have healthy soils, you know. But this is the research that The Ohio State did for me. Dr. Lafitte did this. This is a 5-year study. And this is why Dave Brandt says he don't need to buy nutrients. You know, you can all read, but look at the amount of nitrogen there. Look at the calcium that's in that soil that we're bringing up. Where does this nitrogen come from? It comes from out of the atmosphere. Why are we bound in nitrogen when you go out here and breathe and there's nitrogen in the air? You know. Again, let's lose legumes that pulls that nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Let's make them have nodules and nice roots to feed the corn plant. The Ohio State finally agreed 2 years ago that field corn now can grow into a nodule and use organic nitrogen. It says it don't need to be anhydrous. You know? Planters are designed to do it. They happen to be the soybean plate with winter peas. The little red plate you see back there is the reddish plate or a sugar beet plate, and that's how we do it, precisionally. We like to see green fields in the fall. You know, those are peas and radishes. Whoops. You saw that one later on. There's our precision radishes. Picket fence stands, 4 inches apart, 2.5 inches in diameter, 32 inches deep. Look at the color of that soil. Wouldn't everybody love to have that, Dave?
Oh, yeah.
You know. Again, there they are. Hairy vetch, you know, crimson clover. These are things that can work. Warm season legumes, why not try some? You know? You know, we know that the cool season legumes won't grow in 80 to 90 degree weather.
Do you inoculate your peas?
We inoculate everything because the soil's never seen it before. You must have the right bacteria. Sun him. This is a great story, and then we're going to switch and let Dave talk. But I got this about 15 years ago at a meeting like this. A nice colored fellow stood up from Africa, and boy, he was a-talking, and he was like Dave. He could really tell you the stories. And he was showing me this stuff, and they planted it, and a week later it was 1 foot tall. A month later it was 8 foot tall. A month later it was 24 foot tall. Stalks had 4 inches in diameter. He dug them and had nodulation the size of tennis balls. Can you imagine a piece of inoculant, nitrogen-fixing inoculant in the soil as big as a tennis ball? I fell in love, you know? So I called him and I said, can you get me some of that? And he said, yeah, so he sent it to us. So we planted it in August, and this was in September, and there was about 9 or 10 guys come to visit me, and they wanted to see this sun hemp, and we're standing out in this field, and we're digging, and we're laughing, and we're having fun, and more laughing than we should be, and all of a sudden, 2 state patrols and a deputy sheriff comes roaring in the field, slaps on the brakes, jumps out of the car, guns are pulled, come out in the field, and he says, who owns this? And I said, I do. He said, what is this? I says, it's sun hemp. He says, what do you do with it? I said, look here, and I was showing him digging. I said, take this shovel and dig this. Look at these nodules. Look what we got. He said, sir, you know what this is? I said, yeah, it's sun hemp. He looked at me and he says, are you smoking it? And I says, could I? You know? Wow. You know? What a chance. You know? One more slide here before we get, you know. These are the amounts of nitrogen we found on our farm because we could not find a university that could tell us how much pounds of nitrogen these plants would produce in the soil without burying them. Every time I called a university, they said you had to plow it in to get the nitrogen benefit. You know, when you don't own a tillage tool, it's tough to plow. So we did this for 6 years, and this is what I've determined we can do with these legumes. So just imagine, we got sun hemp and cowpeas, which is a warm season legume, which should be planted after wheat. They won't work after corn and beans. It's not warm enough. Then we got cool season legumes like winter peas, hairy vetch, crimson clover. We could add all that up, and that's 500 pounds of nitrogen. That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it, Bill? My goodness, we could just grow 600 bushel corn with no sweat, you know? So these are what we found out. So that's why we do it. That's why we use multiple species. And my last slide before Dave takes over again, you know, this is diversity. Look at those sunflowers. Best thing we ever did, 1 pound of sunflowers in the field. Most of our land ladies are from 87 to 96. They have a hard time getting out. Do you know what you do? You put 6 of them in a mason jar once a week while they're blooming, knock on the door, smile at them and say, have a nice day. Have them put them on their dining room table, and they love you. You know, guess what? We're getting a lot of 86-year-old landlords calling us, wanting us to farm. Another side benefit. So I'll turn things over to Dave and let him go from here.
Did you harvest them or roll them?
We just rolled them. And they are a great beneficial insect bringer because they are blooming. We've never had them cause a problem with seed the next year. You know, if they do make seed, guess what? The birds come in the fall, and it's really great.
They take care of it.
They take care of it.
I actually got one of these funny little ear things. Oh, yeah, all right. And then, boy, well, that was great. I was ready to just let you keep rolling on.
I want to hear from you.
Well, I'll let them sort of switch. I got a few slides together, but what Dave's just walked you through was kind of like a mini version of the course that he and other farmers like him gave me when I was going around the world to try to interview people about how to restore and rebuild fertility to land. And Ann and I are working now on a new book that picks up from your last slide in terms of looking at whether or not the micronutrient and phytochemical concentration or density in foods that are grown using these kinds of techniques are actually higher than those grown conventionally. And if anyone has data out there, feel free to share it with us. We're in the data vacuuming up mode. Because one of the things that you mentioned in terms of finally of getting the Ohio State out to work on those problems on your farm, has struck me as interesting. One of the most interesting comments I've had in going around and talking about my 3 books on soil at universities is I'll often get the sort of, "You're not at a land-grant university, are you?" comment. And there's a real dearth of system-level studies looking at the effects of combining no-till with cover crops with diversity. You look at studies that have looked at, say, like carbon buildup in soils. And the meta-studies, the studies of studies that review studies to look at the effects of, say, no-till, will come up with various results. Not building carbon, building a lot of carbon. But what they're doing is they're only looking at the one practice that is actually part of the 3-legged stool of the kind of practices that farmers like Dave are using. But when you parse the data and look at the studies that have looked at farmers that have used no-till cover crops and grown a diversity of crops, it all shows large increases in soil organic matter, in soil carbon. But it's a tiny fraction of the studies that have been done. So in those meta-studies, the headline always reads, No-till, not necessarily of benefit to carbon. What I see as the really interesting potential future of this kind of stuff is looking at the systems level and adapting that to different regions around the world. And that's where the kind of stuff that you're doing, where you've had to do some of your own research to basically figure out how that works, is really leading some of the stuff that's going on at the universities. I would love to see far more systems level collaborations between farmers that are doing conservation agriculture and people at universities. I got asked not too long ago to help start a regenerative agriculture center at the University of Washington, but there's only one problem. We don't have an ag school. We don't have a crops department. We don't have a soils department. We have people in the geology department thinking about soils. And when I told my dean that I'd be glad to do this if I could hire like 10 or 12 people, I was kind of told, go out and find the money. Yeah. But anyway, let me move on from the advertising slide to the slide that I wanted to start with. Because as an academic, it's my privilege to be able to do pop quizzes. And I want to give you one right now. Which planet would you rather live on? The blue one? Yeah. And why? Well, there's water. It's blue. There's air. There's an atmosphere. But there's a third thing that we always forget about at a high policy level: the soil and maintaining the fertility of the soil. Those three things are what makes Earth habitable. And this is what we did. I showed this earlier when I was talking about our yard. We turned that beach sand-like stuff on my left hand, on your right, into the dark stuff on the left. And we did it, it turns out, using a suite of practices that were not all that different than what David was using on his farm to do the same thing. I mean, that color difference with your 1971 soil to your soil today, it's not that different. The big difference is we did it with gardening and you did it with commercial farming. And if we can actually, you can take this as sort of a microcosm for what we could do globally. We've turned the dark stuff into the light stuff through our long history of agriculture and our embrace of what we now consider conventional agriculture. We need to figure out how to turn it around and do it the other way. And that's where people like David have shown that it's actually feasible. It can be done. I've had discussions with very high-level policy people in the Obama administration about whether or not you could actually replace Haber-Bosch process-produced nitrogen with biologically fixed nitrogen, and was told flat out it was impossible to actually do enough to make a difference. And then I go visit somebody like David who shows me that, well, not only is it possible, he can show me that he's done it. And as a scientist and as an empiricist, that kind of thing intrigues me, because if somebody can show me that something can be done, then I'm not willing to listen to somebody who will tell me it can't be done. What I want to know is, how did you do it? And how generalizable are the principles behind those practices? What could you take off of your farm and go to your neighbor's farms, or take it to Central America, to coffee plantations, or take it to Canada or other places? And that's where I think we've got an absolutely huge opportunity in the academic world, is to actually start studying the practices that integrate at a systems level to practices that will rebuild soil fertility, and figure out how to adapt those practices to different regions around the world. And I think to do that, what we've got to do is basically look to the farmers who've already demonstrated ways to do it and build off of their lead, and to try and actually bring some of the sort of the rigor of science to the rigor of observations and empiricism, that doing something and showing that it works demonstrates that the theory is not simply a theory. It's a solid idea. And in terms of that, one of sort of my roles in looking at all this is not only to interview farmers who've restored fertility to the land, but then to stand back and go, okay, well, to parse the academic literature, since that's what I'm trained to do. And I'll show you a couple studies along the way. This one that came out, a couple years ago now. The soil organic matter content. I mentioned in my talk earlier today that we've degraded the soil organic matter by about half in the US. This is the most recent study that's sort of come up with that number. And when you think about that at a continental scale, that's actually a truly phenomenal accomplishment. And how have we managed to maintain high yields at a time when we've been degrading the fuel that drives the native fertility of our land? We've done it by replacing the natural ecosystem cycling processes, and we've replaced them with ones that are very dependent on fossil fuels. And if there's one thing that I'm pretty sure of, it's that the price of diesel, the price of things that are made from fossil fuel resources, are not likely to greatly decrease over the next 100 years. You can argue about when peak oil will be, and we can change that by changing our drilling practices and our permitting practices, but we're never going to change the two simple facts. One, we will never run out of oil. Economically, we will never be able to harvest it all. There'll be some that will always be uneconomic to remove from the ground. And the second thing is that there's a finite supply on the planet. Those two simple facts are going to shape the economics of fossil fuel use over the next 100 years, whatever we do about climate change. And so a very pertinent question is, if over the last century we've been using fossil fuels to replace the fertility that our practices have degraded in terms of soil organic matter, how are we going to keep farming, in the world after we hit 10 billion people? And how are we going to sustain this curve in terms of a stable population, all the way off to the right, if the human population does stabilize at 10 or 12 billion people? And as a geologist, to me, the idea of sustainable farming is something that, how do you carry that curve all the way out, way into the future? And we're not going to be able to do it with fossil fuel intensive farming for the reason that, we won't be able to probably do it. We have to also do this profitably. And if we're so dependent on fossil fuels as their price goes up in the next century, we're not going to be able to maintain it. That's a big part of what motivated me to visit people like David and write Growing a Revolution. And again, those three principles from earlier that you just sort of went over demonstrating how they can be done are minimal disturbance, keeping the ground covered, and diversifying rotations, whether that's in what you're growing for sale or what you're growing in between what you're selling. And if you'd asked me about these ideas before I started writing Growing a Revolution, when I finished writing the Dirt book, I really didn't know. I hadn't visited farmers who had actually already done it. But one of the things you get when you visit people on different continents who've had similar success is, at the higher level principles that underpin their practices, those are the principles. Plus or minus livestock. You can think of livestock as an accelerator on the cycling of nutrients. I'm convinced that you don't necessarily need livestock to restore your soil, because you did it without them. But I'm also convinced that you could accelerate the process by using livestock and reintegrating them into agriculture. But the other thing I'm very convinced at this point is that these general principles underpinning conservation agriculture really do translate into different settings, but that the specific practices don't. And that's where the specific tillage equipment, the specific equipment one uses, the specific crops, what to use in a rotation, may vary even on different places on an individual farm. And what we need to do is invest in figuring out how to do that in different regions of the world. And the places that I visited where I saw transformational change on a regional basis were places where the examples of demonstration farms and individual farmers had actually spread and had great impact on their local communities. People who had figured out a system that worked for the soil, the climate, the crops, the culture, and the technological sophistication level of these different regions. That was the challenge. And it's from people who have tried and made, I presume you made a few mistakes along the way. People who tried and made those mistakes and learned from them can save their younger colleagues who come along in the next generation or two from repeating those mistakes. And it's my view that ought to be not just something that is in the purview of individual farmers, but that's one of the reasons universities exist, in my view, is to actually help spread that kind of knowledge. And one of the things I'm frustrated about is, if you look at agronomic research around the country, an awful lot of it is focused on incremental increases to either increase the sale of a particular product or the efficiency of the use of a particular product. There's not a lot, although it's starting, that's going into teaching farmers the principles that underpin practices that are learnable, that once they learn, they don't have to pay anybody to keep using. To me, that the intellectual transformative potential of what people like David have been showing lies right there. It's the example of, teach a man how to fish. That parable is something that I think I would really like to see cloned, and I'd like to see universities embrace and engage in, and do the rigorous science to try and figure out how you would translate that and spread it. Because there is a challenge going from an individual farm to a whole region. But that's a challenge I think we should embrace. And we should embrace it both on the practical level and an intellectual level.
I really think that what we're showing you here today, it's a way that don't do it like David does it, but take the theory of what we're doing. The theory works no matter where we've been. I've been pretty well over the United States, and I've been overseas a couple times, and the things we do here, they can do over there. It's just maybe changing the species to make it work, And you have to try these species because, lots of times you'll find one. Like we tried to find crimson clover 10 years ago, and when I brought it to Ohio, I remember I talked to my agronomist and I talked to my agriculture extension agent, and I says, will this grow here? Well, absolutely not, David. The book says it won't grow north of the Ohio River. Well, guess what? It does. Now it may not be as prolific or it may not be as nice, but it's a different root. We have to learn to put these different roots in to do the things we want them to do because they all give off a different enzyme in the soil that breaks down nutrients that's been unavailable and makes them available.
Yeah, and that was one of the real light bulb moments for me, having been trained in soil science long ago in graduate school, and thinking about, well, what makes for fertility? The idea that the biological part of fertile soil could unlock some of the micronutrients that are in the mineral part of the soil, and preferentially mine them and unlock them and bring them into biological circulation, was something I hadn't been exposed to.
And I know it was a thrill for me when Dave came to the farm. He was there, I think, about 3 days.
Yeah.
And stayed with us, and I didn't have to use a shovel because, man, he was digging. I mean, I thought we was going to have to slow him down because he was digging everywhere, and he was so excited the first day, I don't think he slept very much that night, But these are the things I think that we can do as producers to help our society. I mean, to me, we even call our banker up. If we got a really good-looking corn crop and we want to brag, and it's got cover crop in it, call him up and have him come out and look at it, And then go down the road and point to the neighbor and say, look what that idiot's got. He ain't got nothing. Give me more money, And it kind of works sometimes. But, if you can share your ideas and pass them around, we all can share and get things done and make it a lot better.
And the other characteristic that was common among all the farmers that I'd visited who had been very successful in restoring their soil was that they were tinkerers, right? They experimented. They tried stuff for themselves, different things. And the stuff that worked, presumably you did again or you expanded. And that's a characteristic that I think is also of good academics. It's sort of that curiosity-driven learning. And the willingness to share. One of the things I've been really impressed with the conservation agriculture community is this desire and willingness to share information and data. That's not universal, but it is, I think, that's the way to teach practices. It's the way to change. And I'm excited about the idea that if we could switch the way that farmers think about the soil and thereby switch the nature of the practices that they're embracing to the degree that that can reduce input costs while maintaining yields, it seems to me like a societal no-brainer that we should be embracing it at a large scale. But there is the problem of, well, how do you incentivize people to share that other than out of goodwill? But I think it's an idea whose time has come, and that seems to me to be very effective, but it's a challenge to figure out how to actually do it and spread it. One of the most recent examples I've seen of sort of academic work is Jonathan Lundgren and Claire. I can't quite read her name at the distance anymore, even with my glasses. But they just emailed me a copy of their new paper that came out. That what you see on that is a plot of profitability on the y-axis versus the amount of soil organic matter in blue, and soil bulk density in red. And what they were doing is they were doing a systems level comparison of farms that they termed regenerative and conventional. Farms that were more like David's and farms that were more like conventional farms. And the more regenerative ones had higher soil organic matter. You notice the slope on that blue line is up. The more organic matter, the higher the profit. The more organic matter, and the lower the bulk density, the higher the bulk density, the lower the profit. The lower the bulk density, the higher the profit. In other words, soil structure and soil organic matter were directly translating into better returns for farmers. So the idea that practices that could build soil fertility, build soil organic matter over time, should translate into better on-farm economics over time. And your example of 40 plus years of no-till and soil building, I would love to see that in the year 2050, we look back and saw the same transformation of widespread conventional agriculture into stuff where you're moving that blue line to the right. Because if there's one thing that all of us who live in cities need, is we need farmers to be profitable. because we need you all to stay in business so we can eat. Another graph that they showed, that Jonathan and Claire showed in that same paper, is you have sort of the net cost and income on there, conventional on the left, regenerative on the right. The white zone is profit. The colored bars are expense per hectare, which is what, 2.5 acres per hectare. So you got to convert the numbers if you're used to acres. The point being is that white bar on the right is taller than the white bar on the left. It was more. The regenerative farms were more profitable, and all those colored things are smaller on the right than the left. One of the reasons they're more profitable is that they spent less to actually grow, but apparently they're growing more because the total income bar was higher on the right as well. So if you can spend less by growing more, even an academic geologist can tell you that that's actually a better business model.
Right, and what that does also on the bar on the right shows you that a little more diversity in our operations made them more profitable, rather than just a corn and bean type of rotation.
Yep. And finally, the research that Jonathan Lundgren at Blue Dasher Farm has been doing that I think is so informative and potentially transformational is he actually went out and measured pest abundance on conventional fields that had received more pesticide than the regenerative fields that didn't. Guess which fields had more pests? The ones with pesticides applied. And there's solid ecological reasoning behind that. You're killing off all the predators that eat the pests. Same thing's happening in the rhizosphere when you disturb it with the plow. Same thing happens in your gut when you disturb it with antibiotics and the wrong diet. Our understanding of the ecology of systems is actually progressed to the point where we can understand some of the counterintuitive results that one might get by, when you apply more pesticides to conventional fields, you actually are enhancing the habitat for the pests because you're wiping out the things that eat them. And it's my sort of view that any way that you look at it for the next sort of 50 years and beyond, restoring soil organic matter will be really important for how we deal with agriculture and sustaining it in a post-cheap oil and fertilizer world. That world is coming. It's still over history's horizon. But I turned into an optimist when I realized that farmers like David were making more money than their conventional neighbors by using practices that could actually help us reverse the kind of trends that I wrote about in the Dirt book. Because if there's one thing that I'm pretty sure of is that we're all pretty good at responding to short-term financial incentives. And one of the things that's turned me into an optimist is I see the potential for one of the first times in history for the short-term economic returns to farmers to start to line up with society's long-term interest in sustaining and protecting the health and fertility of our land and of our soils. And if those things can get into aligned and we can get conventional farming to become more organic-ish, as I started to call some of the regenerative farmers that I met who were self-consciously not organic farmers, but were hardly using any chemicals, but wanted to reserve the right to use them if they needed them. If we can convert conventional agriculture into that regenerative style of organic-ish agriculture, it could actually really change the world in a way that would alter the great arc of history that I wrote about in the Dirt book. These are some of the benefits that I found in interviewing David and his colleagues around the world in terms of higher profits, reduced input use, comparable if not increased yields, better carbon sequestration, that all those changes of color from light to dark, that's all carbon, better water retention, which translates into crop resilience, less off-site pollution, all these things translate across. And so how do we promote it? The three things that I wrote about at the end of Growing a Revolution that I focused on were reforming crop insurance and subsidy programs. I mean, if you think about people following incentives, there's some major agricultural programs in the U.S. that could be realigned to actually reward farmers for adopting regenerative practices. I would love to see that happen. Demonstration farms turned out to be pivotal in the experience of regions that had made broad transformations. And I actually think it would be a great use of societal resources to help subsidize the transition for farmers moving from conventional to regenerative farming practices, because it'll pay off, both in the short term in terms of rural economics, but it would also pay off in terms of sustaining civilization at its core, which is agriculture. And that's basically what I wanted to say, other than one other self-promotional thing, which is I've got to fly back to Seattle at 5, so if anyone wants to pick up a book, I'll be out there right after this talk, and then I got to head back to the airport. And how close are we on time? Does
I
anyone
think
know?
we're very close, but,
Oh, we got 15 minutes. Oh, okay.
We're really good. Yeah, we've got a few times.
There we go.
All right, so at the last couple of meetings, it's been, not necessarily maybe increasing yields, but rate of investment, rate of return. You had some charts up there basically saying, hey, it's reduced costs, not necessarily worried about increasing yield, but increasing, signing back the check instead of the front.
Yeah.
So where do you start with that, either day, but where do you start with that? I mean, you tell farmers to cut back, I work in the soil water district, so you say, hey, start with this. Where do you start?
Well, and I'll take it from here, and then Dave can add to it if you want to, Dave.
Yeah, go for it.
When we're trying to help new beginning no-tillers and cover crop users, we always try to start with trying to introduce them, if they're in a corn bean rotation, trying to introduce them into rye after corn, so they get accustomed to looking at something green, understanding they don't need to do that tillage to make that soil loose. And then a year or two later, take them the next step and say, well, maybe we can start reducing the P and the K by 10% and see if we still maintain the yield. Because I think that's how we do it, and then try to convince them that there will be better results by stretching the rotation to a third crop at some point. And that don't have to be wheat. It could be some other type of small grain or something to work into that situation, Because I think sometimes you have to look around at what's in your community, what's going to work, what would work in your community. I mean, if you're the only farmer in a 90-mile area, you used to grow pumpkins, because that just ain't going to work. But there may be something else you could do, to make that transition. And get used to it, and I like to have them put enough out that it will hurt their wallet, because if they only put 2 acres out and they farm 10,000, they don't care, But you got to make sure that you plan enough and start him on a mentoring system where he'll call you or he'll call his neighbor or somebody else that's doing it. There's nothing speaks any louder than a group of 5 or 6 guys around a coffee shop either bitching about what happened or telling how great it's been,
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that I think that's one of the big opportunities for academic researchers is to try and figure out how to take this sort of system that people through trial and error over decades figured out, and how do you actually accelerate the transition and tailor that for the kind of crops and kind of markets that people have in different regions. So I would look to the experience of farmers who've already done it in an area, but I think there's great opportunities for actually trying to tinker further and figure out what the most efficacious way to do the conversion would be.
Sometimes, it's really exciting to me. I was in Pennsylvania 3 years ago talking to a bunch of dairy farmers and talking about cover crops, and I showed them that picture of 20,000 pounds of biomass, planted after wheat. And then I showed no-tilling corn into it. So about 8 months later, this dairyman's got 700 cows. He calls me up and he says, David, he said, we listened to you. He says, we got our cover crop planted. And he says, we got our corn planted. He says, you better come out and look. And I said, well, okay, so I spent 6 hours driving out there to see him because I wanted to help him because I thought it was important enough. And I go out there and here he's got corn 4 foot tall and cover crop 4 foot tall in the same field. And I says, what'd you do? And he says, well, you told us to plant cover crop and then we planted corn, And I thought, wow, I guess I got to do a better job explaining how to do this, Well, all of a sudden, about a month later, he calls me back and he says, we just let it go. And he says, we put that in a silo. And he says, now the cows are milking on that cover crop and corn blend. And he says, we got 7 more pounds of milk a day. He had more protein in his silage. So, guess what they're doing? They're planting cover crop one day, planting corn the next day, and filling the silo. I mean, some of these guys go clear out of the norm. Another example was an Iowa farmer I worked with. He bought a twin row Great Plains planter, a nice planter. So he's planting 32,000 plants in twin rows, And he calls me up and he says, I'm going to send you a picture, David. And I said, fine. So he sends me this picture. And here he's got 2 of the twin rows missing. So the corn rows are actually 60 inches wide. Just imagine a 60-inch wide corn row. And the next picture was Here was 6 different cover crops growing in a 60-inch gap between these corn rows, see? And the next picture was there was 4 ewe lambs walking up the rows, you know? And I said, what are you doing? He says, well, we're trying to produce lambs and grow corn. And he calls me back at harvest time and he says, that 60-inch corn produced the same as our 30-inch corn did. And we got, I forget what it was, 1.5 tons of lamb per acre feeding them in between the corn rows. I mean, some of these guys just take it clear off the scale when you're talking to them, you know. But that's what it takes. You have to think outside the norm. I mean, it's real easy. It's real easy to do corn and beans. You know, you get up in the morning, you get to plow out, you turn over the soils. You call your agronomist, he tells you to put on X number of pounds of NP and K. You do that, you spray it, you go to Florida, and come back and you harvest it. You know, you can't do that when you're using cover crop, though. It takes more management, you know. Yes?
What about the slug?
I think it's a manageable tool, but you just have to learn how to manage them. You know, if you got slug pressure, I think you need to leave that cover crop grow a little bit. Maybe delay the planting till that soil warms up enough. If that corn plant, you know, the slug will not work on that corn plant if there's something else green and growing. If it's actively growing, it'll grow out of the damage. What happens with it, the soil gets cold, the corn slows down, guess what? It eats all the leaves. You know, how much damage does it take on a corn plant? I've seen hundreds of acres of corn in our farm that look like a cigar. As long as I got one green leaf coming out of the top, it's still going to make some yield. You know? But everybody gets excited when they find one little radish or a leaf hole in the leaf with the slug.
We just had, we've gone from slugs in the spring to snails on.
Yeah, I've seen corn, right. But you got to get your beneficials there. You got to quit. You got to think about quit using insecticides, fungicide, neonics. You know, neonic will stay in a slug. Guess what happens when a crabbit beetle or a lightning bug bites onto a slug? The neonic that's in that slug will kill the beneficial insect. You know. Now it's going to take a couple years to get there to have enough, but you need to think about how you're going to do this. You know, to me, a slug is no different than why did you replant that corn when it drowned it out? You know? I mean, guys will replant corn, conventional guys will replant corn and never think about it. I give them a cover crop and the slugs eat it and they're done, you know? Yes, sir.
Dave, Brandt, in your situation, and not knowing for sure how much you told your neighbor who's in conventional tillage, how well things are going on your side, do you see any movement on his side to change his practices and more conservation or not?
I think we're eventually seeing some of them come. You know, our directly neighbors that touch our soils not, but the next farm over, you know, maybe he's 1,000 feet or 2,000 foot away, they're starting to use covers. You know, I think some of the movement's coming, and I think it's going to come right along. It better be slow because there's not enough cover crops produced if it catches to get everybody supplied. So we need to have it grow slow and not fast, you know. Yes.
David, Montgomery, talk about the importance of organic matter that you learned when you were overseas, looking at some of these folks that are doing things over there.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of a common element that I found on farms that rebuilt fertility was rebuilding soil organic matter. The baseline against which they're doing it is different. I went down to sort of the coffee region in Costa Rica, up in the highlands on the central spine of Central America, and was astounded in looking at the rivers through there. They all flow orange. Then you go and you look at the coffee plantations, and the soil is orange. They're oxasols for the soil scientists, and they're basically iron-rich. They're nutrient-depleted. And you look at some of the farms, and there's no topsoil. It's subsoil to the ground surface. You then go into the jungle, 6 to 12 inches of rich black soil shot full with mycorrhizae. That's the soil they started with 100 years ago growing coffee in. They don't have it anymore. So some of the farmers I visited are doing things like using biochar. They're going into the forest to gather mycorrhizae. They then inoculate a nutrient-rich solution with biochar, and they're basically doing large-scale inoculation of their soil to try and start rebuilding some topsoil. And some of the people I visited were having very good success with that, but it was a minority. And in fact, when you point out to a surprising number of people had no idea that the soil in the forest was what they had once had. I mean, it would just seem obvious to me, but there's a real problem in terms of long-term land degradation that we just don't know what it used to be like. Some of the people that I visited, I mean, you've brought your organic matter back up to, I think, comparable to or higher than the native forest. Gabe Brown has done something similar with prairie soils. Neil Dennis did that up in Saskatchewan. So the people I was visited in Africa had also brought their soil organic matter back up to about 4 or 5%, which is comparable to the native forest, whereas the long-term slash and burn agriculture, where once you stop moving it around, if you're always slashing and burning on the same piece of ground, they've driven their organic matter down below 1%. And you get that in the tropics, and you basically are just taking the knees out from under fertility, at which point you are utterly dependent on inputs for yield. And if you don't have any money to buy inputs, you're in a bind. So you can think of the common currency of soil restoration as organic matter. And there's different ways to actually rebuild it. And you could even argue that in many circumstances, at least initially, you're going to need some nitrogen fertilizer, because if you're putting carbon back in the ground, you need to get some nitrogen in there to build the organic matter. So, it's not sort of this simple conventional versus organic argument that we usually have about agriculture. There's a lot of contingency to time scale and place and how you think about it, but the common element was rebuilding soil organic matter.
And that's the reason that we use grasses with our blended cover crops, because we don't want to get the carbon to nitrogen ratio so far out of whack that you can't get these plants to grow. Because you can either get way too much nitrogen, and when you do that, the ground just gets like this concrete, or you can go the opposite way and have 90% carbon and no nitrogen and not get any root growth. So as you build your cover crop blends, always make sure you have some nitrogen fixers and some grass legumes or grasses in there to go along with it.
Yep, same advice for your garden compost.
Yes. Yes.
Do you plant corn and soybean stubble the next year?
Most generally not, because our soybean stubbles usually all goes to small grains, so we don't have any of that left over.
I didn't know what you did, if you did that there, what kind of.
Well, if we were planting back into soybeans, from soybeans to corn, I would look at corn.
Corn and soybean stubble.
Corn.
Soybeans come off, corn can be the next stop.
Well, if that was the case, I would look at clovers, winter peas, hairy vetches, and probably either oats or rye, and keep those at a lower rate so we don't have a problem with the corn being the same class as the cereals you're using, But there's time to get these clover. They're only going to be 2 or 3 inches tall going in the winter, but you have a nice warm spring. We've got clover and winter peas now 2.5, 3 inches tall, and it's only been warm for 10 days, 8 days. We're still getting frost, but they're growing now, because the soil's warmed up. Yes, sir. We got to get them close to in flower or in bud stage. The farther they're mature, the better off we are. If they're not in the flag leaf stage or beyond, it's tough. You can roll them, but they'll jump back up, and then the only thing you got left is some kind of herbicide to take them out.
Or cow.
Or cow. Yeah.
One more question.
One more question. Anybody?
Yeah, Dave.
Yes.
You mentioned in your earlier presentation, consider other crops. Is there something that's going to have to change structurally for us to be willing to put out other crops? People don't hardly want to put out wheat or barley. We're talking about the corn acres and the bean acres nationwide, but nobody says anything about any other crops. What's going to have to change to get us to that longer rotation?
Well, I think what we're going to have to do is, if we want to go to a longer rotation, you're going to have to try to develop a market, or find some place to go with this. There's a lot of livestock out there. I think we're missing the boat by not looking at barley or spelts, because both of those are a great feed additive to a cow-calf operation or to a swine-sow herd. It'll replace corn, so you could create some market there. Or if you didn't want to, I'm looking at the avenues of shortening up your growing degree days on your corn and beans, and maybe giving us 4 to 10 day window by moving your varieties shorter term, because we're seeing great yield from shorter term varieties versus 110 to 120 day varieties. You know, I wouldn't do all of them, but I think 20% of your operation could be 20 in a shorter season situation, and that'd give you cover a little longer to grow. You know, my problem is when you guys have 0.92 or preventive planting, you're out there working with a disc all summer long, and I think if you're going to get crop insurance on 0.92, the crop insurance should say you must plant a cover crop afterwards. Boom, period, or you don't get paid. You know. Sorry, that's the way I feel about it, guys. You know. Well, I'd like to get it done, but you know, because you've probably already taken 0.92 in June or July, you still got a month and a half that you could grow a crop of something. But hell, you know, or you know, I go to Iowa and I see these 35-acre ponds where the water laid in a 100-acre field, and they're out there ripping it. You know, I stopped and told 2 guys last summer, I said, why don't you just stop and plant cover crop in there? Put some peas and radishes in there, break through that hard pan so that water will get down to that tile. There's a standpipe in the center of the thing, and there's water in there. Guess what? There's a hard pan. It ain't going down. You know? To me, it's simple.
Next topic of federal policy.
Okay, yes. And Bill's going to take care of that for us.
All right.